Last week, we started a two-part series on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. In that first part, I mentioned Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, faced not one, but two major crises during his presidency. I would argue that history and the media really remember FDR for his contributions during the Great Depression. People remember him for his radical economic policy during desperate times. His supporters argue that he rescued the American economy with his use of government. His critics would argue that he fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and the individual in a very negative way. But wherever you fall on that issue, there is no denying that he was one of the most consequential American presidents in history. The Depression wasn't the only existential threat the country would face during FDR's administration, though. See, here's the weird thing about foreign policy. Foreign policy doesn't matter to Americans until it becomes the most important thing. We hear of wars and issues far off and maybe feel sympathy, but when something happens like planes running into the Twin Towers in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, Americans wake up to the concerns of foreign policy. It quickly becomes very top of Americans' collective mind. And for many Americans that I've spoken to who lived during that time, the start of America's involvement in World War II was just like that. This is the story of America, FDR, getting into World War II. I'm Will Henry, and this is Quotable History.
There you have it, the damage quite untold. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Quotable History.
Yesterday, December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, the United States was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. This is the quote that many think about when thinking about FDR. I would say that this would be probably the number 2 quote that comes to mind, other than the quote that we talked about last week, which is, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. If you haven't listened to that episode, then just know you're kind of jumping into the middle of this story. So I definitely encourage you to go back and listen to that episode. This would be the beginning of the U.S. involvement in World War II. If you were to look on Wikipedia, you would see that World War II is said to have started in 1939. If, of course, someone hasn't been a goober and edited it on the day that you were going to listen to this. So why were we late to the game? Why did the United States get involved at all? Well, to answer that, let's go back to another instance that Roosevelt was involved in via his involvement with the administration of Woodrow Wilson during World War I. At the end of World War I, the Central Powers, which included the Germans, the Ottomans, Austria-Hungary, and others, had lost to the Allies, which included the US, the UK, France, and others. The Treaty of Versailles, which the terms were largely overseen by Woodrow Wilson, redrew Europe and severely punished Germany for the war. Germany would grow to resent this. Also, Italy, who was on the winning side, would not get what they thought was their fair share of new territory and treasure, and would end up losing a lot, and would also grow to resent this treaty. This would lead to the rise of fascism in Europe. Now, what is fascism? We hear that term thrown around a lot in politics. We especially hear it today in American politics. But what is fascism? Fascism unites groups by nationality, which usually includes some racial component to define nationality, and it unites that under a dictator. It suppresses any opposition and glorifies the idea of the nation above any individual rights or democratic institutions. Mussolini would rise in Italy as the first fascist leader, and then Hitler and the Nazis would do a similar thing in Germany. For the full stories on those events and those figures, keep listening to Quotable History, because I will be covering those soon in future weeks, but it's important that we cover those here now. So ultimately, these nations, particularly Germany, would build their military, suppress political opposition, and eye future territorial expansion. On the other side of the world, things were not going well either. Japan had been under the rule of some unfair treaties since the turn of the century. However, for a long time, Japan had been building up their military and really wanted to prevent Western incursion into Asia. They would have aggressive territorial aspirations. They would join the Axis powers, Germany and Italy, and they would invade Manchuria in China through Korea, which they had already annexed. They would also go further into China and perform some of the worst atrocities of the entire war in an event known as the Rape of Nanking. This would include mass executions and mass rapings of women. With Western influence in the area, like the imperial holdings of the U.S., which included places like the Philippines and the U.K., you can see how this could become a problem involving the U.S. very quickly. So going back to Europe for just a second, on September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany would invade Poland for territorial gain, which was the last straw in a series of events for the UK, France, and other European allies. The Soviet Union, which was another player in this whole scheme, would agree to Hitler's invasion of Poland. However, he would use this in order to later turn on Russia, sort of hoodwink them, and would eventually invade them later. So all of this is going on in the world, but the U.S. wanted nothing to do with it. While there was some concern for fascist movements in Europe and the Axis powers and various territorial gains of different nations, America was idealistically an isolationist nation. What is isolationism? Isolationism is that America, under no circumstances, should get involved in foreign wars. There was an ocean between us, so why should we get involved in something that far away? The America First movement was on the rise, which included prominent figures like Charles Lindbergh, which would push against unnecessary foreign wars. FDR saw the European problem as a threat, but wasn't going to send in troops directly. Neutrality Acts between 1935 and 1939 would be passed preventing involvement in the European war. However, these would be amended to allow for the eventual sale of arms and other goods to the Allies. While Americans did not want to be involved in foreign wars, the war that was going on in Europe would be the central issue of the 1940 election. It's important to mention here that Roosevelt would be unprecedented here. He would run for a third consecutive term. No president had ever done that before, and none have done it since, with the passage of the 22nd Amendment, which happened after Roosevelt, limiting presidential terms to only 2. Roosevelt and his opponent, Wendell Willkie, would both promise not to send troops to die in foreign wars. But Roosevelt somewhat referenced maybe having to do that by saying that we live in this sort of global neighborhood, in speeches like his For Freedom speech. He had a certain understanding of the realities on the ground. Some also say that he had a little bit of Woodrow Wilson in him, who was very much a globalist in nature. He really pushed the idea of sort of a global community. Roosevelt would win the election, I know, huge surprise, and would try to make good on his promise not to send troops to foreign wars. But also, he wanted to help control the chaos. He would institute the Lend-Lease, which would help the British without directly selling them weapons. Basically, he would lend them the weapons with the promise that essentially they were going to give it back in the future once the war was done. This was to supply our allies without having to get directly involved in a foreign war. However, figures like Winston Churchill would really push for the U.S. to join the war. And while FDR was very friendly with Winston Churchill, he would not budge. An act instituting the draft would pass, and service requirements would extend from 1 year to 2.5 years. While Europe was a central focus of the day, it was the events of the Far East that would force Americans to really face the music. Roosevelt would institute a policy that would have the United States stop trading with the Japanese in order to prevent any aid to potential Japanese expansion. Now remember, Japan at this point is already an Axis power. And this was adverse to American values as the government saw them. This, along with Japanese territorial aspirations, was enough to push the Japanese to attack. On December 7th, 1941, Japan would attack Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This would totally change the conversation. No longer was America worried about a war far away. It had hit American shores, literally. This was an absolute shock. While FDR had predicted an attack by the Japanese, he never would have predicted it happening directly on American shores. And on December 8th, FDR would deliver a speech to an emergency session of Congress asking for an official declaration of war. It was approved overwhelmingly 82-0 in the Senate and 388-1 in the House of Representatives. Then, on December 11th that same year, Hitler and Mussolini would both declare war on the U.S., which Congress would respond with a declaration of war on those two of their own. Most historians agree that World War II would push America out of the Great Depression. This was due to the rise in a need for the military and also the rise in American industry that was needed due to the industrial strength that was required for World War II. While the New Deal would be Roosevelt's great change to domestic policy, World War II would fundamentally change both domestic and foreign policy almost forever. Roosevelt would ally with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and really focus on defeating the Germans first in order to take out the central industrial might of the Axis power. But he was also faced with having to continue fighting in the Pacific to repel the ongoing invasions of different territories from Japan. As far as World War II strategy and movements are concerned, we will focus on those in later episodes, but there are some important historical moments and policies to focus on here. FDR would be absolutely instrumental as commander-in-chief in developing different strategies. He would be working with an all-star team of generals and military leaders, including General George C. Marshall, who would be his Army Chief of Staff, Douglas MacArthur, William Nimitz, George Patton, and future President Dwight D. Eisenhower. All of these were working during World War II. And some of these guys would vehemently disagree with his strategy. Like George C. Marshall, for example, would have wild disagreements with FDR. But he was able to listen, consider, and hold his ground with these men as need be. He would help stimulate much industry by partnering with different businesses in order to ensure intense productivity during wartime. He would give the go-ahead to the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb, which would be one of the best-kept secrets ever. It was so secret that newly ascended President Harry Truman, upon Roosevelt's death, had to be told of its existence, which is absolutely wild that the vice president at the time didn't know that it was going on until he became president. He would be a diplomatic leader amongst the Allies and essential in creating a unified mission between powers as different as the democratic UK and the communist Soviet Union. His leadership during World War II was absolutely essential. But there was also a dark side. After declaring war, FDR would sign Executive Order 9066, which would intern over 100,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of which were American citizens. The conditions of these camps were poor, and this would be one of the darkest moments in American history. I think it's very important to clear the air with this particular consideration. There are some people who say that the internment of Japanese Americans was essentially the same thing as what Nazis would do to the Jews during the Holocaust. While the actions of this executive order and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is a very dark moment in American history and was a very evil moment in American history, it's also important to remember that this is not the same thing as the Holocaust. This was not the same thing as rounding up Jews for the purpose of killing them. This was seen as largely a national security measure. This was a very misguided, very mistaken, very dark, and very wrong national security measure that should never have happened. However, the main purpose behind this was not the same purpose as, say, the Holocaust in Germany. But with all that being said, this was an incredibly horrible executive order. Also, Americans with Italian and German heritage would also have various restrictions due purely to their ethnic relationship with the Axis powers. The armed forces would continue to be segregated during this time. FDR was far from perfect in his policies regarding World War II. But ultimately, in the end, I would argue that FDR's leadership was a net positive. FDR would run for a fourth term in 1944. Everyone knew he was frail and ill, and he would select Vice President Harry Truman to be his running mate. And he would still win. But by April of 1945, just weeks before VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, the end of the war in Europe, Roosevelt would die of a cerebral hemorrhage, and he was succeeded by Vice President Harry Truman, who would oversee the end of the war. Now, over the last two episodes of Quotable History, we have focused on FDR. He was a deeply consequential figure in American history, and it's important for us to take a step back and recognize his accomplishments and faults. He unified the country in a major way during two of the most difficult times in American history. The Great Depression was the worst economic period in the country's history, and World War II was the deadliest conflict of all time, and also ranks number 2 in the number of Americans who died in war, behind only the Civil War, which was us fighting each other. So that's a little bit crazy. He would provide immediate relief for Americans in two periods of great uncertainty, and he created new social programs that would change the nature of the relationship between Americans and their government forever. However, it's also important to recognize that he also had his faults in his personal life. He was a womanizer. He had at least one affair, Lucy Mercer, who was with him when he died, and he had potentially more women, which I shared on my TikTok this past weekend. While he would change the economic conditions for African Americans, he would not publicly support measures like anti-lynching legislation or any policies that would further advance the political rights of African Americans. He interned Japanese Americans on the West Coast, denying them many constitutional rights, and as a result of this, Japanese Americans would go on to live in very poor conditions, and some would even die. Many measures he took with his New Deal would create lasting financial problems for the federal government. In the end, though, whatever you think of him, FDR changed the American political landscape forever. He unified his countries with his words and was really a staunch defender of American values. That is all we have for FDR for now, but his legacy continues to live on, and I promise you that we will probably visit him again as Quotable History goes on. I'm Will Henry, and thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Quotable History. If you like this episode, please don't forget to share with a friend and subscribe, and please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. That's going to be Spotify, Apple, Amazon. That would be really, really awesome. As always, I want to thank my wife, Rachel Henry, for her help with this episode. And if you liked this two-part series on FDR, then please share it with a friend, because that's how we grow, one person at a time. If you want to follow our socials will be in the description below. Be sure to go and check those out. I referenced that earlier in this episode today. I have more content there if you are looking for it. And as always, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I really appreciate that you give me about 20 minutes of your time every week to be able to share some history with you. Hope to see you next time as we dive into more great quotes. And until next time, have a great week.